Welcome to the Dynasty Dummies podcast. I am your host. I'm not really a host. I'm Zach Reed, and I'm joined tonight by J Mike. As usual, he's going to host, but this is a special show. Buckle up. You're in for a treat. We're going to talk a little bit with one of my favorite analysts. He should be one of your favorite analysts. We're going to talk. It's startup season. Everyone is giving you the value of Marquise Brown, how you should be drafting Cortland Sutton, how you shouldn't draft Zeke. This is not going to be that at all. That's granular. That's this year. That may not even be this year. That may be this week. What we're going to do is back up. We're going to take a look at things from 30,000 feet and actually give you a foundation, a process. And we've got Leo Paciga at Siga _FF, DLF Professor Emeritus, the man more synonymous with notebooks than Ryan Gosling. But we're not going to talk about his notebooks tonight because there's so much more. But I'm going to hand it to J Mike because I'm just going to gush if I keep going.
Listen, what a privilege it is to just to have this time to be able to be back together again. It's been a rocky month of June, but so much has happened since the last time we got together. And now with Leo here with us as well, I think there's a lot that we can continue to dig into because here we are. The draft has taken place. Scott Fishbowl is in the air. Birds are chirping. Things are beautiful. And all of a sudden, we have so much in the way of flexibility. We have so much in the way of creativity. And now's the time for us to be able to paint the beautiful pictures that we want to paint inside the lines, outside the lines, redefining the lines. Now's the time when we can get really creative when it comes to constructing our roster and doing all the wonderful things. So before we get too deep into those weeds, let's welcome Leo. Leo, what's good, sir?
Well, it's good to be here with you guys. I mean, that's first and foremost. This is a privilege for me to sit in with you guys. You guys do a wonderful podcast. It's one of the podcasts that I don't listen to many, but this is one of the ones that I do because you guys do a great job kind of always skirting the edges, which is where the action happens. And so I appreciate that a lot. And it's great to be here. And I'm flattered and humbled by the kind words that you guys have laid out for me. So hopefully I can live up to the billing.
Very good. Very good. And as Zach laid out, just to give everyone a little bit of expectations, what we'll talk through. We're going to talk about having fun this offseason, this 9-point scoring season, the flexibility that you have. We might talk about, we might go a little bit deeper into some Eisenhower matrix and some other things going on. We've got a lot that we want to be able to touch on tonight. The first place that I do want to start, though, Zach, you're always mulling something. Your wheels are always turning, whether you're with your boys, whether you're at work, whether you are eating a beautiful bowl of gelato. Talk to us about where your brain's been of late.
So I've been stuck on Daniel Kahneman again since we last talked. I'm still there. He is absolutely amazing. He is the Nobel Prize winning economist, but I still think he's a closet dynasty player. And one of the things that I just listened to him talk about is noise. And you hear that a lot when you talk to Peter Howard. You hear that a lot when you talk to the metrics guys. But there's noise wherever there is judgment, and noise is kind of the average error is bias. Noise is that standard deviation. So like the breadth of mistakes, and the way that we as fantasy football analysts and fantasy football players can kind of digest that, I think, is especially headed into startup season, is ADP, the average draft position, the aggregate. That's where the noise gets filtered out because you have enough people taking a crack at one specific problem that all of the different errors get averaged out. But when you start looking at your individual drafts And I think this is going to be where we can jump off with Leo. Different things happen. You're going to have a lot of noise once you get down into an individual draft. There may be value that falls. Maybe Patrick Mahomes doesn't go in the first couple of picks, and now you got to make a decision. And so it's important, I think, to understand. Yes, the ADP is pretty accurate, but it's not necessarily accurate to your individual draft. It gets really noisy in there. And so how do we kind of attack that, approach that, prepare for that without giving you specific players? Because I think if we give you players, we're feeding you. But if we give you a framework of how to attack, how to approach, how to think, how to process places where other people aren't necessarily looking, we're going to teach you how to cook, and you're going to be much better off.
I like that a lot. I like that a lot. Leo, let me ask you this. When you hear Zach talking through filtering the noise, because we know that obviously as the non-point scoring season rolls on, the noise continues to buzz, continues to percolate, then it starts to boil. Then we have a fever pitch. By the time we get to training camp, everybody's saying something about something. When it comes to startups, draft positions can be extremely volatile depending upon what your favorite analyst or what your favorite website is doing. How did you go about filtering out the noise, filtering out all of the voices to be able to boil it down to the things that are most important to you?
So first, let me say, I agree with Zach a lot in most cases. I mean, we've kind of established that over the few years that we've known each other. But he's talking about noise, and Rita McGrath has a book where she talks about seeing around corners. And in that book, she talks about making sure you're present where the snow melts. Because when you're buried in snow, you can't see spring is approaching. But if you are where the snow melts, or you venture out to where the snow melts, where the activity is, that's where you start to see where change is, where it's brewing. And so I think it's critical, as he's talking about noise and filtering it out, it's critical that you're where that action is taking place in life, in fantasy football, in anything really. I think in order to see around corners and protect your family, protect your investments, to protect your dynasty assets, whatever that looks like, you need to be where the change is taking place. As far as filtering out certain noise, and you're right, as we gear up and we head into the summer months and we get OTA, rookie camps, OTAs, everything gets underway, everyone starts having a player of the day that, vultures are just waiting for. Told you so. I told you he was going to drop passes. I mean, think about it. Jamar Chase was dropping passes in the preseason and everybody was ready to jump off. And now he's the hottest dynasty commodity at wide receiver out there. So it's just crazy. The recency bias, the day-to-day functions of these off-season requirements that the NFL teams have. What I would say, long-winded, but what I would say is that it's crucial that two things. One, that you know who you are as a fantasy player. I think it's crucial that you understand what works for you, as far as being able to digest risk, as far as whether you feel like once you invest in a player, you're invested, but you're in a stuck pot, you can't get out. You kind of have to know how you tick, what makes you work, and then you can kind of adjust your strategy to that. So you really have to be comfortable with, knowing yourself. And then it's through practice and repetition. I think a new dynasty player isn't going to handle it the same way that someone who's been doing it for 15 years is going to handle it. You build familiarity with the ebbs and flows of an offseason. You build familiarity with hype as you spend more and more hours invested in the hobby, in this pastime. Probably the most crucial component is trial and error, weeding out the voices that don't make the most sense, that don't jive with what you how you want to be as a player. If you're a risk-averse person, the last thing you want to do is listen to a voice that's constantly telling you to swing for the fences. You need to have harmony, and that harmony only takes place when you start to weed out that noise. And it's an actionable function. You can't just sit back and say, the cream is going to rise to the top. No, you're the filter. You have to filter out the noise that doesn't set with you and it doesn't work for you.
I love that. And sorry, I don't mean to jump off, J Mike, but I love that. And this kind of dovetails into the notebook and how, so when I first started listening to Leo, and this was years ago, like when I first came into the Dynasty space, everybody was talking about players. Everybody was telling you that Amari Cooper was the next big thing, and everybody was telling you that Mike Evans was coming in as a rookie and was going to be the guy, whatever it was. And Leo was talking about knowing your league mates and knowing yourself and understanding how to make decisions and keeping track. And one of the first things that I wrote in the original notebook, because I do the notebook thing too, and it's again because of Leo, because I think that was a brilliant way to kind of get my mind around what I needed to do. It's keep track of your decisions and reasons behind them so you can revisit and see what is common, whether it's mistakes, whether it's successes. And I think that if you can do that for yourself, even if you're not going to commit to doing that for your league or all of the analysts that you listen to, if you can do that for yourself, you're going to be so far ahead of the game, understanding why you're making decisions and why the decisions are good when they are and why they're bad. And then you can avoid kind of some of those pitfalls. So it's not just noise in the community, not just noise on Twitter, not just noise about the players, but there's also that in you, and you can kind of mitigate some of that by continuing to look at and revise your decision-making process. I mean, it's the same thing we talk about with our rookie evaluations. And we're always adjusting, tweaking, figuring out what's being successful, trying to figure out being on the vanguard of how the NFL is changing to make better decisions. You can do that. And maybe this is a life podcast, because you can do this. All of this applies to your life as well. But man, it's a really nice edge in fantasy football.
I was really nervous about this, but I think we're about to go somewhere really interesting. So this is, I think this is crucial. You both just talked about the importance of knowing yourself and knowing your tendencies, knowing what you're comfortable with. And I think it was Socrates said to know thyself is the beginning of wisdom, something of that nature, but know thyself, right? As we, and I think this may be for newer Dynasty players, and I think this can even be for folks who aren't comfortable or haven't found their footing, whether it be in the Dynasty space or in fantasy football, period. So whether it be redraft, whatever format you like to play, I think it's a really, really interesting thing to dig in on, knowing yourself. So let me pose this to you guys. Zach, I'll give you first word here, and then Leo, you can piggyback from Zach. When you are developing strategies for yourself, and I know you touched on it a little bit, particularly, again, for newer people and people who aren't super comfortable with their own perspectives on things, who maybe constantly are leaning on popular voices, who maybe constantly are leaning on ADP, or constantly leaning on the Matthew Berry love-hate. Whatever it may be. And that's obviously no shade to Matthew Berry or anybody else. It's just a matter of this is what people do, right? This is how people function on a day-to-day when it comes to fantasy. When it comes for you, and let's talk through your alls. What was that process, or what did you have to lean into or go through to find out what you're comfortable with and knowing your personality, your perspective when you leverage leagues, or when you leverage how you go about building teams, finding edges, leveraging strategies, etc.?
So I think it's a little bit like trying on clothes to start. Like, you don't know because this is all new. And so you listen to, when I first started playing fantasy football, I was listening to everybody. I was listening to that fantasy, we're in the 06, so what? I was listening to that. I was listening to everybody. Like, I was listening to, the nerds. I was listening to DLF. I was listening to everybody. And then once I started to kind of get my footing and figuring out, how I like to play and what I like to. I started narrowing things down. I started narrowing it down to people who think a lot like I do, and I started narrowing it down to people who think completely differently than I do, because I think you need that dissenting voice to either reinforce your position or show you another angle, because it's important to me to understand that I'm not necessarily right. I want to get to the right answer, but I'm not necessarily starting from right. So if I listen to people who just think like me, there's a real big avenue for failure. So it's finding that direction that you want to be, getting the confidence in that, but then having that confidence to listen to that dissenting opinion and either reinforce yours, make it stronger, or go, oh man, I never thought of that. That's a great way to look at it. And so that's my advice is, if you're new to this, consume content, consume a lot of content, but be discerning with what you're consuming. Because it's the same thing that we've talked about before, J Mike. Not every piece of advice is good advice. It's all valuable advice, but it's not all good advice.
Yeah, I would have to say, again, I agree with everything that Zach just said. For me, one word, mediocrity, was the driving force. There's nothing I despised more in my 30 plus years of playing this hobby was being mediocre. I didn't like finishing sixth and just making the playoffs. I didn't like finishing seventh and not having the top pick in the draft. That middle tier is awful. And so that was always the piece that drove me to either, I've said it on Twitter numerous times, I was almost always blowing up a team, because if that team ever set, if that team set into that, just that middling spot, it was time to blow it up. It was time to try something new. Again, it's trial and error, like Zach said. I mean, you don't know when you first start out, especially in this hobby and Dynasty. You don't know what really works, what doesn't work. It's just when you see it come to fruition, you have to have a keen enough eye. And this is where tracking yourself as well as tracking your league mates comes into play, because you do have to have a point of reference. And I'll give you an example. In fact, I went and pulled it up on Twitter because it was a thread that I put out back in January. And basically, there was a point in time where I was the guy that had to draft the youngest player. I tried to build my rosters with as many young potential performers as humanly possible. And the worst thing is early success, because then you think that's the winning formula. And it doesn't mean that what your process works. It just means you got lucky. And sometimes luck is misinterpreted, and it's not really success. It's luck. So there was a time where I remember having arguments on Twitter where I was validating Dante Moncrief was the next Colt wide receiver to own. He was the next. I remember posting data, and I don't have it in front of me. His increases over the last 8 games of a particular season, and Ty Hilton was on his way out, and blah 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 blah. I mean, it was, and I fully believed it. And what I learned, obviously, that was completely the wrong choice. Hilton went on to have, another 4 or 5 years, very successful, until the injury set in. Moncrief faded away and ended up playing in Jacksonville, and was never materialized into what I projected, what I thought he was going to be. The prognostication was awful. And so that was a learning experience, because I remember documenting that in one of my notebooks for the league, one of the leagues where I was like, I'm building my roster around these 3 wide receivers, and Moncrief is one of them, and going back and looking at it and going, how could I have been that stupid? Again, learning experience. So now, all right, so what did I do wrong there? I devalued a productive player based on age, based on what I thought might happen. And it was I kind of flipped a switch in that regard going forward from that scenario, where all of a sudden aging vets became far more valuable to me in even my rebuilds, because bottom line, I could grab somebody that only had another 2 years left that wasn't a piece for my team, but would be a piece for a contender. And so, whereas I avoided them like the plague early on in my dynasty career and wanted nothing to do with them, and I was going to be the guy that won every championship with 23-year-olds on his roster, to being somebody that really kind of understood and didn't, I wasn't parading against ageism out. I started to see value for what value was. So that was a huge learning experience for me. And again, it was documented. I went back and looked at it. I would write down, this is what I'm thinking when I'm doing this. So it was easy for me to go back and look at that and say, okay, this was my thought process. It was bad, so don't do that again. So
that may be the most important piece of this entire show is it's okay to be wrong. It's okay to be wrong. You're going to be wrong, but understanding when you are, why you are, and then learning from that, getting it right is the important piece. It's not the entrenchment effect. It's not sitting there and digging your heels in and trying to make yourself right, even though everything is pointing in the other direction. Don't do that. Like, it's okay. It's okay. You can trade players. You can cut players. Your identity is not tied to these players. I am still a dynasty analyst. I'm still decent at this, even though John Kelly didn't hit, even though I loved John Kelly pre-draft that year. And I thought he was going to come out and be the next, thing, a 3-down back. It's okay. And I understand, and we've talked about this ad nauseum, but I understand the reasons why he didn't succeed. I understand that looking at players who initiate a ton of contact in college is really tough to have that translate in the NFL, because now all of a sudden every single defensive player that is hitting a running back in the NFL was the best player on their team. They're NFL players. This is what we're doing. And so understanding that you can be wrong, figuring out why you were wrong, and then adjusting so you're not making that same repeated mistake is so important.
And I want to add one thing: arrogance and avoiding the arrogance is crucial, because I just went back and I found, and I actually wrote this. So, this was awful, but I actually said back in 2016, I wrote, dynasty folks who wrap themselves in their 3-year production cocoon can own all of the T.Y. Hilton shares they want. I'll take the wide receiver turning 23 who has shown solid progression over 2 years and who I believe will leapfrog Hilton by mid-2017. I mean, again, I couldn't have been more wrong, but even worse than that was the tone of that tweet, and the fact that, I was basically, criticizing folks that really had it figured out and I didn't. And so part of the learning process for me was that, what Zach said, failure is okay, and understand that everything that I think, we talked about this before the show started. We're lucky as analysts if we get 60% of our predictions right. I mean, that's good. That's a good percentage rate. Anybody who says they get 80, 90 is just fooling themselves. So when you're dealing with that, have a tone that's just a little more understanding of the fact that failure is baked in. Because if you approach it with that sentiment and that lens, digesting the failure will be easier, and learning from it will be easier, instead of having to eat crow and hold on to a player or a prospect longer than you should because you were pounding the table with such arrogance early on.
That's my favorite part about Peter Howard as a metrics analyst, because he will tell you, okay, I've got this great predictive metric. It's going to increase your chance of success by 6%.
Yeah,
and you sit there and that's a great, and he's so open and honest about the fact that there's so much nebulousness in this. There's so much room to fail that all we're trying to do is mitigate that failure. I mean, if you can not fail that extra 6%, That's great. And if you can do that 2 or 3 times, wow, now we're cooking. We've made some ground on the rest of our league.
It almost seems it would be so much better if all of us really came to the table and understood that eating humble pie is so much better than trying to serve it to others. And not to say that early dynasty struggles are like the linchpin of really getting to a certain place and not having this arrogance take over. But in the same vein as you all explained, and I really hope that people understand this as they listen to this podcast, the failures, the places where you've fallen on your face, the places where you've gotten something so wrong, the really awful trade that you made that everybody made fun of and you regretted, all of these things are pieces to the puzzle that allow you the opportunity to, again, better understand yourself and perhaps most importantly, take you from where you are to where you want to be. And that is something in terms of the journey that anyone worth their weight in salt will tell you that it's the times when I didn't quite have an understanding, when I didn't really have a grasp of what was going on, where it took them to some places and trying new things and hearing new perspectives and not leaning primarily on just their own thoughts, understanding that everyone has something valuable to bring to the table. And I think that that's something that really can launch people to a whole new space. And it's uncomfortable. It is uncomfortable, but it's well worth it. Go with that, Zach.
The smartest people I know, whether it be in dynasty football or just in life, are the people who, when they don't know something, ask the people who do. You're allowed to do that. Like, this is great. And Twitter now with all the availability, I mean, you can sit there and ask Ryan McDowell a question. You can ask Scott Fish a question. You can slide into Peter Howard's DMs. Like, you can talk to Leo. Like, Leo will post on Saturday and have a thread of all of this great information. And you can just jump in, comment, and have an interaction with Leo. So, like, all of this stuff that you don't have to sit there and not know or continue to make the same mistakes. It's we talked about this a little bit, but that sunk cost fallacy, where if you continue based on what you've already put in the same direction and just continue to like pitch it, I always say pitching sand against the tide, but like if you continue to shovel that sand trying to fill in the ocean, you haven't succeeded, you haven't moved forward. You don't have to keep doing that. You can change direction. You can ask. You can figure out a different way to do things. And I think it's so important to understand that. It's so important to understand, again, not knowing something doesn't make you stupid. It doesn't make you bad at this. It just means you don't know. So ask people who do know that sort of thing. And that's one of the things that I'm really proud of myself, especially as a fantasy football player. But I try to do this in life. I try to be really upfront with my shortcomings. Like, and look, there are a lot. I have flaws. I have many flaws. But when I identify one, I try to also identify somebody who does whatever I do poorly well, and I try to borrow from them to improve my flaws. And it was, I always go back to Russ Fisher and Shane Manila, because when I first came into Dynasty, I had not made a trade. I played redraft. I didn't understand the finer points of trading. I wasn't great at trade valuation. I wasn't great at that initial pitch. I didn't like the back and forth. I didn't like the banter, the bartering. I didn't like any of that. But I identified the trade addicts and Dynasty Trades HQ. Like, these guys know what they're doing. I've seen them in leagues making tons of trades. So I started listening. I started asking them questions. I started going on their show, pretending like I was helping them out, being the guest, but I'm really actually learning way more from them than they are from me. I'm getting, I'm benefiting from this. And so that's like, that to me is one thing that you can do. I mean, you know what you don't do well, whether it be fantasy football or whether it be life. You figure that out, and all of a sudden make that, if not a strength, at least not a weakness, by borrowing from other people, by understanding what people who are successful with that do.
I love those points so much, Zach. Leo, earlier you mentioned talking about, even in your rebuilds, diving into the veteran player market and allowing them to be part of your process for your future solutions. Let's pivot away a little bit from this identity piece and how we formed ours and those opportunities, and let's dive a little bit more into another piece of that as well, which is that managing assets piece. So when you're looking at building your roster and obviously taking I think some would call it a contrarian approach to bring on veterans during rebuilds, what does that look like for you to be able to create rosters or create opportunities for yourself to be able to really take your teams to another level and get where you want to go, which is obviously contending for championships on a year in and year out basis? What does that look like for you to be able to manage those assets and take those approaches to find those edges? And I think that this maybe even introduces part of the Eisenhower matrix, which you had tweeted about this evening as well. So take us anywhere you'd like to go with that thought.
So I guess let's talk about existing leagues, because the Eisenhower matrix I generally use. I found it a beneficial tool when I'm going into, especially a slow draft. It's harder to use in a live draft where you've got a quick turnaround between picks. But when you've got anywhere from 4 to 12 hours on a clock doing an online draft, it's very easy to make that flexible. So we can get into that a little bit more later. But let's talk a little bit about existing leagues. So the key for me in existing leagues is, and I know we're not going to spend a ton of time on a notebook, but is really knowing your league mates. First of all, you need an active league. If you're not in an active league, then I would never recommend that strategy to anybody, because it's going to force you into more wins, which you don't want. And you're going to get stuck cutting that veteran player somewhere down the line anyway. So, but we all want to be in active leagues that really are, always pushing the trade meter. And so in those leagues, identifying certain members of your division or certain members of your league that always panic when it's the stretch run and they have an injury, or they have 3 consecutive games of poor performance. Somebody who has Odell Beckham when he was with the Browns, and all of, they picked him up and they thought he was going to be a wide receiver 2 and plugged him into their starting lineup in August and thought they were set. And then all of a sudden the production isn't there. Right. Or there's a quarterback change on a team and all of a sudden the starter goes out. Now there's a backup quarterback and all the receivers on the team are struggling. There's always an owner, a league mate in those situations that falls into that category, maybe more than one. Some leagues have 3 or 4 that fall into that category that are extremely active, band-aiding their rosters, band-aiding their starting lineups in a crisis. So in those leagues where that's taking place, beating them to the punch for a veteran player, reaching out and understanding that this player, he's 30 years old. He's 31 years old, but all of a sudden he's got a starting role. All of a sudden he's punching in 2 touchdowns a game as a running back, or he's catching 6 passes and a touchdown as a tight end, whatever position. That all of a sudden becomes now such a trading chip, such a, it's just an activity now that you can engage in, because now what doors to knock on. That they're going to be looking, and they're not going to pay a premium price because of the age, but it's still going to benefit you. So I would actively look for those players that I thought were going to have a huge stretch run, that were over 30 years old. Ideally not running backs, because even the price point on running backs drops so dramatically at 30. You can still get a decent haul for a wide receiver, quarterback, or tight end that hits the 30 mark. But running backs, maybe 28, maybe like a Raheem Mostert, if all of a sudden he was healthy coming down the stretch, and he's a guy that all of a sudden he's not long-term answer for your dynasty, but he's somebody that you can certainly flip and potentially get a second rounder, or you could get a potential diamond in the rough and a third round, or whatever that looks like. So yeah, I mean, bottom line is every asset that you can acquire, and again, the key is an active league, but every asset that you can acquire becomes is desirable to somebody else, regardless of age, if the right circumstance, approaches. But you have to be willing to take that. You may get saddled with that player. There is a chance that no one is going to need him. No one's going to get hurt. Everyone's going to produce wonderfully. And you're stuck now with a 33-year-old wide receiver that added 2 wins to your total. It's part of the game, but it's certainly worth the risk. And I certainly encourage teams that are rebuilding to use that avenue if they have a league where there's guys who buy that, potential player coming down the stretch.
I'm going to riff off that for just a second and say one of the biggest epiphanies I've had in the last couple of years is I started rostering players, adding players that I don't necessarily like, that the community does, that ADP does. I mean, it's the Gabe Davis, it's the Chase Claypool, it's players that other people are higher on than I am, because now all of a sudden they're a trade chip. It becomes an asset. It becomes something that not only is it a player that other people value, but it's not a player that I'm tied to. It's not a player that I'm worried about giving up. And so it's kind of a twofold thing where, and again, it's like Leo said, you've got to be in active leagues. If you're not in active leagues, this sort of thing doesn't work, because you end up with a player you don't want on your team and you can't get rid of it. It's not fungible. But if you're in active leagues, taking on a player that the community likes more than you do can be a real win for you, because then you can trade that player for another player that you actually do want. And so I think that's something, to kind of piggyback on that age thing, there's also a value component to that.
And we know that in this fantasy space, values and as Leo was talking about earlier, the soup of the day, the player of the day changes so frequently. And so I love both of your points, especially because, and I want people hopefully to listen close, the timing of you leveraging the moves is of utmost importance. I'm going to say it again. The timing of you leveraging moves is of utmost importance, because one of the trends that we're seeing in so many leagues and in so many conversations is that these players, even at the wide receiver position, as they get up in age, whether it be these late 20s, 30, 31, all of a sudden it is becoming increasingly hard to move off of certain players. Your Keenan Allens, people who have been stalwarts for years and obviously connected to a quarterback that people love. For whatever reason, guys like Keenan Allen, guys like Adam Thielen. I was listening the other day to a podcast, and they were talking about the value of Adam Thielen essentially being, hey, can I take Adam Thielen, put him with a third, and get a second for him? Like that. This is where we are with players when they get to a certain age, where it becomes, listen, it's you have to be very comfortable with them finishing their careers on your rosters. And so, marrying what you all said, I know I'm coming right back to you, Zach. Marrying what you all said, even within active leagues, I'm going to say inactive leagues, the timing. So right now in the non-point scoring season, you're not going to be seeing a lot of these veteran wide receivers move. You're not going to see these deals where multiple firsts are being shelled out for guys like Devontae Adams. People are just not willing at this time to be moving off of those type of picks to be able to bring those players on. So you staying connected to obviously what the value's happening, whether it be in Twitter or ADP or all these various podcasts, and you staying in check with what your league is doing and what they're valuing with their moves, even within drafts, even within the waiver wire, being able to track these things and being cognizant of what's happening around you will allow you those opportunities, even if it's a very small window, because it may only be a 2-week time frame where you can get a guy like Keenan Allen over to someone as a Band-Aid to help them for their playoff push. Zach, go for it.
Yeah, I mean that's the whole micro market thing, and we've gotten so plugged in. Twitter has blown up. Facebook has dynasty chats and things. We've gotten so everybody's in Discord. Everybody is so plugged in now. You're getting alerts on your phone that these windows happen so fast, and getting ahead. You talk about timing. Right now, you're right. People are talking about Keenan Allen is dust. They were talking about Mike Evans until the whole thing where Gronk retired. Now Mike Evans is the new flavor again. But you're seeing that Peter Howard is talking about, and he's been team old guy forever. He's talking about this year, maybe the year to sell your older players. Right now, while people are talking about that, is the time to get them on the cheap. This is a great time to make offers and get players cheap who are older, who are the declining assets, who in that season, when the points are being scored, when people are looking at their total points, they're looking at their lineups going, man, I could really use another wide receiver one, but I don't want to pay a wide receiver one price for him. Oh, look, Keenan out. You can make those moves, but it's micro markets. It's paying attention to the fluctuations. It's paying attention to almost daily at this point, maybe even more than that. Like we're at an age where the information comes so fast. The voices are so loud from the analysts. And I think people are so worried about missing out on the next thing or whatever's hot that they overcorrect, they overshoot, they overpay. And you have that real narrow window where if you have the player that everybody wants, you can basically name your price. You can get that overpayment, but you got to make that move. You got to make it quick. You got to be ready, and you got to pull the trigger.
Yeah, I think social media is a trade catalyst in itself, because the talk, the hot topic, the OTA darling, whatever that looks like, drives so much again, trade discussion, opportunity. It was crucial for me as I was doing Dynasty the last few years to understand what sites, which podcasts, where were my league mates going for information. And it would become pretty evident quickly, even if they had an alias, or even if they had, whatever they were on Twitter didn't line up with what they were in the leagues. If all of a sudden somebody came on, Podfather came on, or somebody came on and said, or Matthew Berry and his love hate, and put out you got to get this guy, or, this is the absolute number one buy. And all of a sudden you saw offers come in, or you saw trades being made. Well, it was easy to kind of notate, all right, well, I wonder if that was driven by this commentator or this analyst, and then notate it, and then wait and see, okay, the analyst just said this. Is there going to be any action on this by this particular league mate? And if there was, kind of narrow down what their silo was for information. The crazy thing is, and where this gets, again, when we talked earlier in the show about kind of narrowing your voice, is on any given day, you can plug in any person's name, any NFL player's name on Twitter, and you're going to about he's the absolute must have, and 20 tweets about he's the absolute must sell. So a new player getting bombarded with that slack tide of information is going to be, well, what is it? Is it a buy or is it a sell? And if they only follow these two people that are saying sell, are they really getting, is there a consensus? It's really difficult to filter that out, as we talked about earlier. But yeah, I mean, there's so much information, there's so much overload. It's so now and immediate, and the updates and the, and we over sensationalize the most trivial components of a practice. If somebody breaks a 5-yard run and puts 2 jukes on, which is really every running back in the NFL can basically do that, all of a sudden that just becomes the most amazing thing ever. And because we over sensationalize everything, it's really difficult to put the proper weight on that, and why it's so important to really have an anchored voice that doesn't doesn't just live in hyperbole 24/7.
I am, and I laughed so hard at that, Leo, just because I feel like that is just commonplace now. And the beautiful thing is we have so many people who are open to sharing their perspectives. One of the drawbacks is we have so many people who are willing to share their perspectives and a lot of shouting back and forth without actually hearing each other out. And like you said, really difficult to draw consensus. And I think that one of the things that people are so nervous about often is they don't want to end up being a meme on social media. They don't want to be the poll where they're the people are voting their side, the 12% side, and the 88% on the other side for the trade that they did. People get really nervous about that and don't want to end up being the butt of a joke. So I think navigating that space well and understanding the limitations, understanding the piece of this that says, hey, I want to be able to make sure that I'm working diligently to filter out and make this lane my own, to understand where I'm trusting, where I'm leaning. And as we had touched on before, understanding your own perspective and your own identity in this space, I think that that's key. And even when it comes to something like slow drafts, we kind of end where we began, this idea of when we're looking at ADP and when we're looking at how we go about making our decisions when we're on the clock, in times where we have a little bit of time to be able to breathe and think and strategize and plot and really set the trail for what we want to be able to execute. Leo, let's walk through a little bit in reference to that Eisenhower method and how you lean on it to be able to maximize your opportunities that you have when you're on the clock.
So I think any draft strategy that doesn't entail a blueprint to start, we talk about being able to adjust, to be flexible, to read the room, to read the draft, to understand runs, positional runs, all of that, scoring format, starting requirements, all of that is all just thrown into the pot, stirred up, and it all comes into play. So you really kind of need to have a blueprint as to, all right, what's your plan? Is it tight end premium? Do you want to have a tight end by the fifth round, or do you want to get one of the big three? And if that doesn't happen, then you're just going to punt the position. Is it super flex? I know Zach and I talked earlier. I'm not a huge fan of super flex. But if I do play, like Scott Fishbowl is super flex, I will tell everyone so they all know that I'm not leaving that draft without two quarterbacks in the first 3 rounds. I just sleep better at night knowing that I have 2 quarterbacks in a super flex. And you can tell me all the value in the world is going to fall and I'm an idiot for doing it, but I sleep better with 2 quarterbacks on my roster. I know that about myself. I'm leaving that draft with 2 quarterbacks in the first 3 rounds. I don't care who's available in that 3rd round. I'm taking a quarterback. So anyway, my point being is, in order to adapt, you have to have a plan, or you're just have no strategy at all. So the Eisenhower matrix, it works for me, and it goes by. It's also called the urgent important matrix. It's been talked about for years, but basically what it does is it breaks down what are your important actionable items. What are your important decisions that you can kind of make as you proceed? So you have your non-negotiables when you start. You have your decisions that are still important and will shape, your outcome. And then you have your not important section, where you're going to have distractions that are still relevant, but they can take you off your focus, off your game completely. And then you have the avoidance box, where you can list what you want to avoid, whether it's a particular coaching staff, whether it's a quarterback change situation where they're bringing in a new starter, wide receivers change teams, whatever that looks like, whatever you feel strongly enough about that you're like, I'm not drafting anyone from that team or anyone from that position group on that team, regardless of how much value falls, because I'm not going to deal with that. So for me, it's just a really good tool to kind of set the blueprint. When you're on an online draft, a slow online draft, you've got between, like I said, 2, 4, 12 hours, whatever that clock looks like. So you can kind of go in. It's a blueprint, but it's not set in stone. It's not one of the 10 commandments that was carved into a rock. You can be fluid with it. You can adjust it. You can even reset some of your necessities based on how the draft board has shaken out, but at least it gives me a course of action so that, this is what I went in wanting to do. And again, for me, it's taking notes. I go in with a plan. I can't comment on, write down, notate the changes and why I made them if I don't have that plan written down to start. So if all of a sudden I pivot, if I go into a draft saying I'm not drafting a tight end in the first 8 rounds, and all of a sudden Andrews is there in the 5th round for some reason and the value is just too great, and I pivot, well, that's a note now. That's okay. This is why I know I said I was going to do this, plan A, and then I pivoted to something completely different, but here's why. So now I can validate the process. Now I have a point of reference. But again, for me, it's tracking my successes and my failures is a big part of my life, regardless of whether or not we're talking fantasy football, whether we're talking about, my job in operations, in management, whatever that looks like. I always track my successes and my failures in my home life. Just, as a parent, I did it just because I don't want to constantly fall into the same pitfall. And I want to understand why I made the decisions I made. And for me, this Eisenhower matrix just works really, really well for just setting a 10,000 foot blueprint on how I need to approach things.
When I saw this in my head, I heard my dad. So my dad was a baseball coach. He's in the Maine Baseball Hall of Fame, coached for 30 years. And I heard him say, I'd be playing shortstop, and he'd say, have an idea. And that sounds really simple, but what it really meant was there's a runner on first and third. There's one out. Now run through the scenarios. Understand what you're going to do if something happens, and this is exactly what you're doing with this matrix, with laying out what you need to do, what you want to do, what's not important, and what you want to totally ignore within a draft, and being able to pivot based on the situation, based on what happens, because as we all know, like, each draft is its own animal. No 2 drafts are the same. You've got ADP. That's great. But the draft that you're in is not going to follow ADP. The draft that you're in is not going to follow convention. There are going to be people who do things that are going to be, totally different than what you're expecting. And to have this before you go in, have an idea of what you'll do when situations arise is so important. If the ball is hit hard at you, you can turn that double play, get out of the inning. But if it's hit to your right, you got to go home, because there's no way you're turning, you're not turning 2. You got to get the out at the plate. And it's the same thing with fantasy football. It's Leo sitting there saying, I got to get 2 quarterbacks coming out of the first 3 rounds. Like, that is a necessity. We can't let this run score. I got to get 2 quarterbacks. Having an idea, having an understanding of what you're doing beforehand not only allows you to, in the moment, make a more rational decision, but it also gives you a framework to riff, to play that jazz, to move, to adjust, to adapt. And I love it. And it's the thing that I get caught up in. And we talked about this before the show. I can draft a rookie draft in my sleep. I prep. I know almost from February what I'm going to do in my rookie drafts. Definitely from the end of April. I know. And if you have my pre-draft, post-draft rookie rankings and you're in a league with me, you know what I'm going to do. You knew, J. Mike, we're in a home league together. I had the 103. You knew that Treylon Burks was coming off. You knew at that turn coming back into round 2 that David Bell was coming off. Like, you knew that. I'm so locked in with Dynasty, with rookie drafts, because I prepare, because I know exactly what I'm doing. The Scott Fish Bowl, because it's a redraft, and that's not what I play anymore, man, I am so bad. I get so off my game. I get so caught up. Last year, I drafted Kyle Pitts in that 3rd round reversal, and it was too early. And I knew it was too early. but there was so much Kyle Pitts hype. It was the crescendo. It was he's the best prospect since Gronkowski, and he's going to do this and he's going to do that, and it's a tight end premium. And I rationalized, and I didn't have this preparation. I didn't have, okay, this is what I'm going to do. This is what I want to do. This is what I might do, and this is what I want to avoid. I didn't have that. And it's so simple. And seeing Leo lay it out like this, man, like I don't know how I don't know how he didn't do it. I don't know how I missed it. But it's such an advantage having an idea going in.
And to add to that, because I think you all put that incredibly well. There's a lot that you'll hear that says that being flexible is someone's primary strategy. And while being flexible is good, being flexible, I'm not sure that it helps you optimize just saying that, hey, my strategy going in is to be flexible. It's still, being flexible doesn't tell you, okay, if these things happen, now what? Right? Being flexible is a contingency plan, right? Being flexible is something that you go into when necessary, right? Break glass in case of emergency. This allows you to be able to navigate your primary plan. What you really want to be done.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to step on you there, but okay. Really, if your plan is to be flexible, you have no plan at all. You're letting the others in the draft room or in the live draft, whatever it is, you're letting them dictate your position. You can't let everyone else dictate, and you're going to adjust to them. You want to have a plan so that you can at least, you can funnel folks in a certain direction. And the one thing I will add too is that even the ones that I have listed as necessities, if all of a sudden I'm in the Scott Fishbowl, for example, because that's on everybody's mind and and it's wonderful, and I'm glad we're talking about it. But if I'm in that draft and I've got a quarterback, I drafted a quarterback in the second round, we're coming up to the third round, and I count out, okay, my third round pick, then I've got another 7 spots till a turn. Let me count the quarterbacks I'm comfortable drafting in the fourth round. Okay, there's 8 of them. I mean, again, I'm just throwing numbers out there, whatever that looks like. But if I can count out spots and I can say I'm comfortable with the talent, even if there's a run, even if every single quarterback goes off the board before it comes back to me, I'm comfortable with this guy, I'll still adjust the necessity box and pivot to that because I know I'm okay. So again, I had said that it wasn't, written in stone. And I just want to emphasize that flexibility is key, but flexibility is based on your initial strategy, not everybody else's initial strategy.
I love that. And it always, whenever I'm in a league with somebody who, zero RB doesn't work, or, you can't go late round quarterback, you got to go, I'm always like, all right, we're going to write that down, because if you dismiss a strategy without understanding it, then you limit yourself. If you understand the strategies, you don't have to use them, but understanding the components of the strategy allows you to use them and allows you to, if you're in a draft and all of a sudden you're in round 10 or 11 or 12, and you understand the idea behind zero RB, and you understand anti-fragility, and you understand that all of a sudden these running backs can be incredibly valuable when there's an injury or when there's an opportunity, and you can pivot to that, not dismissing a strategy, understanding all the strategies, even if you're not going to use it, even if that's not the initial strategy that you go in with, having that in your back pocket, being a Swiss Army knife, being able to adapt to the situation. And then again, you talk about driving a draft and making that draft yours and making people bend to what you're doing. If you understand all of those strategies and you find a place in the draft where all of a sudden the optimal strategy is doing something different, you can continue to drive that draft. You can continue to make the optimal moves if you understand all of those strategies. And so I think like that's, man, it's so much fun to talk to somebody who is instead of getting granular, instead of getting down to the players, instead of talking about, okay, well, this is the ADP and this is who you should draft. Man, the strategy, the nuts and bolts, the putting together the framework, the erector set, and having this idea, having this draft platform to dive off and be able to attack a draft with is so much fun for me to talk about. This. Man, I think the edges aren't where everybody else is. That we forget that if everybody else is doing something, that's not where the edge is. The edge is where everybody else isn't. And I think so much is neglected with the psychology of your league, your league mates, and yourself as an advantage.
In the immortal words of American philosopher Frankie Valli, oh, what a night! This has been a privilege. What a great time, guys! And I love how we've covered so much ground, whether it be the identity piece of getting a better understanding of knowing yourself, all the way through to what it looks like to be able to help build your plan and understand what you actually want to do, and understanding when a strategy is not an actual strategy. I love the discussion, and I think this has been incredibly useful and obviously incredibly helpful as people continue to launch into this next portion of the non-point scoring season, where startups are happening, where news is coming out, where Scott Fishbowl's coming up, best balls heating up for folks. I think this is a very vibrant time, and I think this discussion fits so well with where we are in the calendar, and will most certainly be evergreen as it pertains to, again, identity, confidence in building that and being able to lean on that. I think it's an incredibly special thing. Leo, thank you so much for joining us this evening. What are you up to? What do you want to tell the good folks out there who are listening and checking us out? How is life with you? What do you want to go forward with from here?
Well, I had mentioned, hold on, my cat's walking in front of the she's getting a little, she wants some attention, I guess. So I'd mentioned earlier, this is the first year that I've really taken a step back, and I'm really not involved in many leagues, only the Scott Fishbowl this year. And I'm finding that kind of refreshing, and just focusing on the aspect of fantasy sports that I really like. I've written a couple articles recently for Dynasty League Football. That's my home, and where I produce content. And I don't do a lot of it, but when I do produce content, that's where it's at. And, basically I'm available, nights and weekends on Twitter, and certainly happy to reach out and help anybody who has any questions concerning, my notebook strategy, or how I apply, any of the psychological strategies. That's the part of the fantasy sports that I really, really enjoy talking about, similar to Zach and you both, and what you cover on this show. But I'm certainly available, so I can be reached at, Ciga, CIGA_FF on Twitter, and certainly anybody who wants to reach out and ask a question, I'm there and certainly willing to answer.
If you don't take Leo up on that offer, you are missing out. Like, go search his handle, go scroll through his timeline, learn and profit.
Preach. Literally, like right now, pause the podcast, pause the video here on YouTube. Just listen, we're going to finish up well. Go handle that. We'll be here. Thank you for doing that. Hopefully you paused and took care of business right there. But Leo, again, what a pleasure it is. I'm looking forward to whatever recycling center is going to be getting your notebooks. Because I'm sure that they will be thrilled to be able to create some beautiful things to recycle, reduce, and reuse all of the paper and things that you've been able to leverage over the years.
I'm hoping that at some point the Fantasy Football Hall of Fame decides that they want to put museum is what I'm hoping for. One day when I make it to the Fantasy Football Expo, and maybe I can bring them along then, and we can have them enshrined.
That'll be so good. Essentially, right next to the Bill of Rights, will be Leo's notebooks. I'm here for it. Leo, thank you again, man. Greatly appreciate
Thank you for having me, fellas. Appreciate it.
Zach, this has been beautiful. I am, again, grateful to be here with you, grateful to continue forward as we walk and talk all things Dynasty Dummies, and try to be able to help bring people together, help people, again, discover themselves and drive forward for their own strategies and things of that nature. So, Zach, it's yours to close.
Normally, this is where I shout out all the guys on the DFPN at work. I'm going to truncate that a little bit and just talk about the Scott Fishbowl Podathon. That is coming up July 9th and 10th. Sal, Kevin, and Steve are going to do 36 hours with a little help from the friends. We're going to hop in. We're going to help them out. But it is guests for 36 hours straight, live streamed on YouTube, all fantasy football, all the time. There's even going to be from 2 to 4 on that Saturday, there's going to be a live Scott Fishbowl draft broadcast on the Podathon. There's going to be a whole bunch of great information, great people, your favorite analysts you didn't know but will become your favorite, and donations. Like, that's the whole thing. It's charity. It's raising money for Toys for Tots. It's raising money for Fantasy Cares. We've been able to, the last few years, the Scott Fishbowl has gotten so big that we've been able to kind of spread the love, spread the charity around. It's gotten so big and so much fun. It's become my favorite part of this community. And it really is a community. And the Scott Fishbowl Podathon is that reflection back, that mirror showing how great this community can be. So tune in July 9th and 10th, donate, watch, enjoy. There's going to be a live chat. You can interact with, Matthew Berry's going to be on there. It's going to be amazing, and be a part of it. Like, come in, be a part of it. That's the best thing I can say. So that's my truncated. This is me being, if brevity is the soul of wit, I shall be brief. Outro for this week's show. But I think that's gonna. I think that does it for me, J Mike. I think that that's where we'll leave it. Leo, thank you for coming on. J Mike, appreciate you soft tossing, letting us just hit line drives all around the park. It's there's nothing quite like having a good host. So thank you for listening. Thank you for following us. Thank you for letting us talk some game theory and some psychology, because I think that's where the edges are. This has been the Dynasty Dummies. Peace. And then I got to find the button.
Hit the button, Zach.